watching Big Brain Energy.
Subsidies. What? Who benefits from a subsidy exactly? How do I show a subsidy on the graph? Can subsidies ever be bad? And what happens to producer and consumer surplus when there is a subsidy? I know what a subsidy is, but I need to know the specifics. Well, you've come to the right place. In this video, we will cover exactly what a subsidy is in economics terms, how you draw the subsidy graph, how elasticity of demand affects subsidies, how to word your answers for the NCEA 3.1 external, and then we'll finish up with some practice questions. If you're new here, check out our playlist where we cover everything you need to know for the NCEA Level 3 Economics External 3.1, demonstrate understanding of the efficiency of market equilibrium. Let's get into it. A subsidy can be defined as when the government covers part of the cost of a good or service. Basically, they can either pay part of the cost that the consumers have to pay so that we can get it for cheaper, or they could pay part of the cost for a firm so that they can receive more profit, or they can do both at once. Usually, when we think of a subsidy, we think about the government reducing the costs for us consumers, but they can also do the same thing for producers. The purpose of the subsidy is generally to encourage people to buy more of something, because if it's cheaper, then people will buy more of it. We typically see subsidies on things like public transport or healthcare or education. Electric cars is one that's happened recently, medication, agriculture. So basically, it's things that the government wants us to be able to access, so they subsidise it, they make it cheaper for us. This is something that New Zealand does pretty well compared to other countries like the US, although there are some other countries, especially in Europe, which are even better at subsidising things. Okay, let's have a look now at the subsidy graph. So the subsidy graph begins with the regular demand and supply graph. We have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. And then we have equilibrium price and quantity of this thing that is being bought and sold in this market. To show a subsidy on this, we draw in a subsidy curve which is parallel to the supply curve and on its right. We label this subsidy. We might see it labelled as S plus subsidy or something similar. It's all the same. We can draw in a new equilibrium now where the subsidy curve crosses over the demand curve. We label this QS for the quantity under the subsidy and PC for the price that consumers pay with the subsidy. You can see that the price consumer pays is less because they've been subsidised for part of it. And the quantity that they buy is therefore more because it's cheaper for them. Now here's the tricky part. We need to keep drawing the QS dotted line up until it hits the supply curve. And then we go across to the price axis and we can label this price PP. This is the price that the producers receive, which you can see is higher than the original price. This is because part of the subsidy goes towards the producers, so they get that money as well. So it goes partly towards consumers and partly towards producers. For each of these graphs, you will need to know 1, how to draw the graph, which looks like this, and 2, how to shade and label the consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, and impact on the government. The consumer surplus is this big blue triangle here. It goes from the price that consumers are willing to pay, which is the demand curve, down to the price that they actually pay, which is PC, and out all the way to the quantity that they buy, which is QS. The producer surplus goes from the supply curve, which is the amount that the producers are willing to sell for, to PP, which is the amount that they actually sell for, and all the way out to QS, the amount that they sell. You can see this graph is a little bit different here because the consumer surplus and producer surplus actually overlap. This is because the subsidy is going both towards the consumers and the producers, so they both benefit from it. The value of the subsidy is this box here. This is the amount that the government pays, so it's the difference between what consumers pay and what producers receive. So this is the government covering this extra cost. And it goes all the way out to QS because this is the amount being brought. There is also some deadweight loss, which is this grey triangle here. This deadweight loss is because they're paying this whole box of the subsidy, but there's a portion of it that no one is benefiting from. You can see that this little triangle here isn't being covered by the producer or the consumer surplus, but it is being paid for by the government. So it is potential value that isn't being utilised, so it is deadweight loss. Alright, and that's the subsidy graph. Let's have a look now at how elasticity can impact subsidies. If you're unfamiliar with the elasticity of demand, we have a video which you can check out on our channel, linked down below, where we introduce the concept of elasticity. Inelastic demand means that a change in price will result in a proportionately smaller change in quantity demanded, and the curve is steeper. whereas elastic demand means that a change in price will result in a proportionately larger change in quantity, and the curve is flatter. So let's draw in an inelastic demand curve. We can see that when we have an inelastic demand curve, this results in the increase in price for producers being quite small compared to the decrease in price for consumers, which is quite big. Let's have a look at an elastic demand curve, which has a flatter demand curve. You can see here that the increase in price for producers is quite big compared to the decrease in price for consumers, which is fairly small. So this results in differences to who benefits the most from the subsidy, the consumers or the producers. So both the producers and consumers benefit, but by different amounts. With an inelastic demand curve, consumers benefit more from the subsidy because the price changes for them by quite a large amount, whereas the price for producers changes by quite a small amount. So the portion of the subsidy that goes towards the consumers in this inelastic demand case is larger than the portion that goes towards the producers. The opposite is true for elastic demand. The change in price for consumers is quite small compared to the change in price for producers. Therefore, the portion of the subsidy that the consumers receive is less than the portion of the subsidy that the producers receive. So when something has elastic demand, the consumers benefit more. In the Level 3 exam, they like to ask you about the impact of a subsidy on consumers, producers, the government, and allocative efficiency. It's honestly quite predictable what kinds of questions they ask, which means you can basically come up with a model answer to each of these types of questions. Let's go through some model answers. Let's first look at the impact on consumers. You can say that when there is a subsidy, consumer surplus increases because the price consumers pay decreases from PE to PC, and the amount that they buy therefore increases from QE to QS. This means that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and actually pay increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. Hence, consumers are better off and consumer surplus increases. That sentence there, when we say that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and actually pay increases, that's just a definition of a consumer surplus. So we're saying that consumer surplus increases. When we say that there are more units from which to gain a surplus, what we mean here is that they are buying more, so therefore there are more opportunities for them to benefit. That wording is what they like you to say in the exam, and that's how you get an excellence answer in the exam. Let's look now at the impact of a subsidy on producers. When there is a subsidy, producer surplus increases because the price producers receive increases from PE to PP, and the amount that they sell increases from QE to QS. This means that the difference between what producers are willing to sell for and what they actually sell for increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. Hence, when there is a subsidy, producers are better off, and producer surplus increases. In the exam, they might ask you about the impact on either producers or producer surplus, or consumer surplus, and the answer for both is the same, whether they include the surplus or not. Now let's have a look at the impact on the government. When there is a subsidy, the government is worse off because they have to pay for the subsidy. So this means that the government has less money to spend on other projects, like, for example, building roads or infrastructure or healthcare. However, the government will achieve its goal of encouraging people to buy more of that subsidised good or service, or helping the business to remain profitable. So the government has to spend some money, so they're worse off, but that money may align with their other goals. Let's now look at the impact of a subsidy on allocative efficiency, which means how efficient is the market operating? Is it operating as good as it possibly could be, or are there some people who aren't benefiting as much as they could be? The market is allocatively efficient before the subsidy because surpluses are maximised and there is no deadweight loss. When the subsidy is added though, consumer surplus increases and producer surplus increases. However, these increases aren't enough to outweigh the cost of the subsidy to the government, as indicated by the deadweight loss. Hence, when there is a subsidy, the market is not allocatively efficient, total surpluses are not maximised and there is a net welfare loss. So basically what that means is, yes, the consumer and producer surpluses increase, but that increase is offset by the amount that the government has to pay. So the net positive is less than the net negative. So that's why there is deadweight loss. Alright, now let's do some practice questions. We'll also soon be uploading a video on our channel where we go through a past paper. But for now, let's try and consolidate what we've just learned. Let's begin with fill in the blanks. The government can either pay part of the cost that blank has to pay so that they can purchase it for blank, or part of the blank for a blank so that they can receive more blank, or they can do both at once. The answer is that the government can pay part of the cost of something that consumers have to pay so that they can purchase it for cheaper, or the production costs for a firm so that they can receive more profit, or they can do both at once. What is the overarching purpose of the subsidy? Generally, the purpose of a subsidy is to encourage people to buy more of something, because if it's cheaper, then people can buy more of it. Which of these products is most likely to receive a subsidy? Alcohol, public transport, or private schools? The answer is public transport. This is something that the government typically wants people to have better access to. Which of these products is most likely to receive a subsidy? A Harry Styles concert ticket, Netflix subscriptions, or dentist visits for the children? The answer is dentist visits for children. I'm not exactly sure what Chris thinks of Harry Styles, but I'm pretty sure taxpayers wouldn't be that happy if we subsidised his concert tickets, although I would be happy. Illustrate the impact of a subsidy on the graph below. Here is the answer. We draw in the subsidy curve, which is parallel to the supply curve and on its right. And then we have the new equilibrium QS, PP, and PC. Shade and label the new producer surplus and consumer surplus and the deadweight loss. Here is the answer. Consumer surplus is always on the top, producer surplus always on the bottom, and in this case they overlap each other. And then we have the deadweight loss, which is this grey triangle. Shade and label the subsidy received by consumers and producers respectively on this graph. Here is the answer. The difference between the original price that producers receive and the price that they receive now is going to be the value of the subsidy that they receive. And then the difference between the price that the consumers pay now and the price that they originally had to pay is the portion of the subsidy that the consumers receive. Does an item with elastic or inelastic demand have a steeper demand curve? The answer is inelastic. Elastic has a flatter demand curve. Do producers or consumers benefit more from a subsidy on an item with elastic demand? The answer is that producers benefit more. The portion of the subsidy that they receive is larger than that for consumers. Conversely, do producers or consumers benefit more from a subsidy on an item with inelastic demand? The answer is that consumers benefit more with a subsidy on an item with inelastic demand. Explain the impact on consumers when a subsidy is implemented on public transport with reference to the graph. When there is a subsidy on public transport, consumer surplus increases because the price consumers pay decreases from PE to PC, and the amount that they buy increases from QE to QS. This means that the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and actually pay increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. Hence, consumers are better off and consumer surplus increases. Basically, consumers like subsidies on public transport. Explain the impact on producers when a subsidy is implemented on electric vehicles with reference to the graph. When there is a subsidy on electric vehicles, producer surplus increases because the price that the producers receive increases from PE to PP, and the amount that they sell increases from QE to QS. This means that the difference between what producers are willing to sell for and actually sell for increases, and there are more units from which to gain a surplus. Hence, when there is a subsidy, producer surplus increases. So subsidies for electric vehicles is good for producers as well. Explain the impact on the government when a subsidy is implemented on healthcare with reference to the graph. When there is a subsidy on healthcare, the government is worse off because they must pay for the subsidy. This means that the government has less money to spend on other projects like roads or infrastructure or healthcare. However, the government will achieve its goal of encouraging people to have better access to healthcare or to help the healthcare industry to remain profitable. Basically, the government doesn't like paying a subsidy on healthcare because they have to pay a lot of money, but it does help their other goals of helping citizens to be more healthy. And finally, explain the impact on allocated efficiency when the subsidy is implemented on education. Before the subsidy on education, the market is allocatively efficient because the consumer and producer surpluses are maximised and there is no deadweight loss. When the subsidy is added, though, consumer surplus increases and producer surplus increases. However, these increases do not outweigh the cost of the subsidy to the government, as indicated by the deadweight loss. Hence, when there is a subsidy, the market is not allocatively efficient. Total surpluses are not maximised and there is a net welfare loss. Alright, that was everything on this video for subsidies. Check out our playlist for other topics within this Level 3 External. Feel free to leave comments down below with any questions that you'd like us to answer about the content, and you can also let us know in the comments what topics you'd like us to cover next. The market is saturated with American-based content, and there is very little educational videos on NCEA economics in particular. If you would like to support this channel to keep running, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It really helps the algorithm. See you next time for more big brain energy.